Althea Vaughn built her empire on one rule: paperwork never lies. So when two boys from the West Side interrupted her foundation announcement and accused her company of stealing their grandmother's house, she dismissed them instantly. Publicly, calmly, definitively, to her, they were another risk to neutralize. But that night, after the headlines spread and critics began questioning her acquisition records, a private DNA test was quietly authorized. 48 hours later, the results arrived: 99.8% probability of shared bloodline. The same crescent birthmark, the same ancestral trace, the same property at the center of a decades-old family fracture. The boys she labeled liars were not strangers. They were her cousins. And now the question wasn't whether the property belonged to them. The question was whether a billionaire who escaped poverty was about to admit she helped erase her own family's legacy. Althea Vaughn's name carried weight in cities that rarely bowed to anyone. In Atlanta and Chicago, her developments reshaped skylines and redirected economies. Financial networks described her as disciplined, strategic, and nearly immune to miscalculation. She had risen from a childhood marked by eviction notices and utility shutoffs to commanding rooms filled with venture capitalists who once would have dismissed her presence. Her success was not inherited, it was engineered. Every contract she signed reflected a philosophy she had carved into herself long ago. Survival required precision, and precision left no room for sentimentality. Though she funded scholarship programs and urban literacy initiatives through the Vaughn Future Foundation, those who worked closely with her understood the distinction she maintained between charity and vulnerability. She believed opportunity should be measurable. She believed assistance should be structured. Years of corporate battles had sharpened her instincts against manipulation. In her experience, stories could be crafted, tears could be rehearsed, but paperwork did not lie. Documentation was truth. Emotion was noise. On the morning her foundation announced a multi-million-dollar redevelopment project on the West Side, the atmosphere carried the controlled excitement of expansion. Cameras lined the barricades. Reporters rehearsed their introductions. The brownstone property newly acquired for transformation stood behind her podium, draped in a banner bearing the foundation's logo. For Althea, this was not merely a purchase, it was a symbol of reinvestment into communities she once called home. Security tightened as she approached the stage, but two teenage boys slipped through the outer crowd before anyone recognized their intent. Their clothing was modest, their posture rigid with contained urgency. They did not shout. They did not plead. They simply stated that the brownstone behind her belonged to their late grandmother, Laverne Reed, and that Vaughn Enterprises had taken it under disputed records. Their claim was direct, unwavering, and impossible to ignore. Althea studied them the way she evaluated business risks. She did not see desperation, she saw accusation timed for maximum visibility. Without raising her voice, she dismissed the allegation as unfounded and irresponsible. She explained that every acquisition passed through legal review and community compliance. Her tone was calm but final. The crowd shifted. Cameras zoomed closer. The boys stood silent, absorbing the rejection without retreating. The moment crystallized into something sharper than a press interruption. It became a public fracture between power and poverty, authority and accusation. Social media feeds ignited before the conference concluded. Commentators debated corporate ethics. Some defended her track record. Others questioned the speed of her dismissal. As security guided the boys away, one of them adjusted his sleeve in quiet frustration. A crescent-shaped birthmark flashed briefly against the morning light. Althea's composure faltered for half a second. The mark was unmistakable, identical to one she had carried on her own shoulder since childhood. The cameras did not capture the shift in her eyes, but something inside her had just begun to unravel. Micah Reed had learned early that survival required composure. At 17, he carried himself with a restraint that made strangers underestimate him. He studied people before speaking, calculated outcomes before reacting. Caleb Reed, 3 years younger, moved differently. At 14, his strength was observation. He noticed details others overlooked, subtle gestures, inconsistencies in paperwork, shifts in tone that revealed more than statements ever could. Together they functioned as balancing strategy and instinct, protection and faith. They lived in a weathered duplex on the West Side, where winter drafts slipped through thin window frames and the plumbing knocked like an old engine struggling to start. Their grandmother, Laverne Reed, had raised them after their mother passed away from an illness that went untreated for too long. Laverne filled the house with strict discipline and quiet pride. She insisted on keeping every document, every tax receipt, Every utility bill filed in labeled folders stored inside a metal cabinet near the kitchen. She called paperwork protection. She called history armor. The brownstone now claimed by Vaughn Enterprises had been her greatest treasure. It was modest, aging, but rich with memory. Laverne used to say it belonged to more than bricks and mortar, it belonged to blood. After her death, confusion followed, probate delays, missing signatures, a holding company acquisition filed during a period when the boys were navigating school counselors and funeral expenses. By the time they understood what had happened, the property was listed under a corporate redevelopment plan bearing Althea Vaughn's name. They were not chasing money. They were chasing correction. Micah remembered a business magazine cover years earlier featuring Althea at a charity gala. On her shoulder, visible above a sleeveless evening dress, rested a crescent-shaped birthmark identical to the one Caleb carried on his forearm and Micah bore near his collarbone. Laverne had once traced that mark gently, describing it as proof that their lineage stretched further than hardship. She spoke of distant relatives separated by pride and silence, though she never revealed names. The resemblance unsettled Micah enough to investigate property records deeper. The deed once listed a partnership decades-old Reed Vaughn Holdings. The connection was faint but undeniable. Their approach at the press conference had not been reckless, it had been deliberate. They believed acknowledgement would open conversation. Instead, dismissal closed it publicly. Reaction divided quickly. Some commentators framed them as opportunists exploiting a wealthy woman's visibility. Others questioned how such a transfer occurred so quietly. The boys endured the criticism without retreating. Pride prevented them from fading back into obscurity. Loyalty to their grandmother demanded persistence. Late one evening, Caleb discovered an archived photograph dated 1986 while scanning digitized county records. It showed two siblings standing in front of the same brownstone, both bearing the crescent mark. One of them carried the Vaughn surname. The past was no longer rumor. It was evidence waiting to be understood. Althea Vaughn did not lose sleep over public criticism, but she did monitor risk. By the evening of the confrontation, trending headlines had begun pairing her name with words like dispute and inheritance. That alone justified inquiry. She summoned her chief counsel, Grant Holloway, instructing him to audit the acquisition trail of the disputed brownstone. Her motivation was not guilt, it was containment. If there was even a procedural flaw, she intended to correct it before speculation hardened into narrative. Grant returned with confident reassurance. The purchase had moved through a holding entity, then into Vaughn Enterprises during a redevelopment sweep of distressed properties. Signatures were verified, taxes cleared, compliance secured. On the surface, the paperwork aligned. Yet as junior associates combed through older archived documents, a discrepancy surfaced buried beneath digitized transfers from decades earlier. A defunct family trust had once held partial claim before dissolving under ambiguous terms. The trust's name was concise but unsettling: Reed Vaughn Holdings. Althea stared at the scanned file longer than necessary. Vaughn was her mother's maiden name before she remarried and cut ties with relatives she rarely mentioned. Growing up, Althea had absorbed a simplified version of history. Her mother spoke of betrayal, of a brother who mishandled family assets and vanished after an inheritance dispute. The story had always been framed with certainty, leaving no room for ambiguity. Althea had internalized it as fact, another lesson in why trust required documentation. Now documentation suggested something different. Reed Vaughn implied partnership, not theft, shared interest, not disappearance. The possibility unsettled her more than public accusation ever could. If the trust once represented joint ownership, then the narrative she inherited might have been shaped by pride rather than proof. Across town, Micah and Caleb pursued their own line of verification. They located a retired notary who had overseen paperwork for their grandmother years earlier. Age had thinned the man's memory, but certain details remained vivid. He recalled witnessing tension between two siblings disputing stewardship of a brownstone passed down by their father. Neither sibling appeared malicious, both appeared stubborn. The disagreement stalled formal consolidation, leaving fragments of ownership that later became vulnerable during legal transitions. A brother, a sister, shared blood divided by silence. The alignment between past and present grew sharper. The crescent birthmark was no longer coincidence. The trust name bridged surnames once separated. Still, Althea refused emotional interpretation. She instructed her legal team to request preliminary DNA screening, framing it as due diligence rather than acknowledgement. Verification would determine whether the boy's claim carried biological weight or remained circumstantial. Internally, however, doubt had already breached certainty. If blood connected them, then the confrontation on stage was not a scam but an echo of unfinished family conflict. The request for DNA comparison was submitted quietly, flagged confidential within corporate channels, unseen by the public eye yet powerful enough to shift everything once results arrived. The results arrived without ceremony, delivered through encrypted channels marked confidential. Althea Vaughn reviewed them alone in her private office overlooking the skyline she had helped construct. The numbers were clinical, unemotional, stripped of commentary. Probability of shared paternal lineage 99.8%. The margin of doubt was nearly non-existent. For a woman who trusted statistics above sentiment, the data left little room for denial. Her expression did not shift when she closed the file, yet something internal fractured with quiet force. If the report was accurate, Micah and Caleb Reed were not strangers exploiting publicity. They were family. They were descendants of the uncle she had been taught to distrust, the branch of her bloodline described as reckless and opportunistic. For decades, that version of history had shaped her worldview. It had informed how she assessed risk, how she guarded assets, how she separated loyalty from liability. Now the certainty of that inherited narrative felt unstable. The crescent-shaped birthmark she had once considered a private quirk of genetics appeared in medical documentation attached to the boy's screening profile. It was no longer coincidence, it was confirmation. A symbol she had worn without reflection now carried implication. The same mark that once distinguished her quietly at private gatherings had become evidence that her family's story was incomplete. Through formal legal correspondence, the boys were notified that additional genealogical verification would proceed before any structural decisions were made. The language was neutral, procedural, deliberately distant. Micah interpreted the communication as delay disguised as protocol. Caleb interpreted it as fear. Neither saw the internal shift occurring within the woman they had challenged. Outside corporate offices, public scrutiny intensified. Investigative bloggers began dissecting redevelopment acquisitions tied to Vaughn Enterprises, searching for irregularities beyond the disputed brownstone. Analysts debated whether rapid expansion had allowed technical oversights to slip through unnoticed. Competitors watched closely, aware that perception alone could weaken even the most fortified brand. Althea faced mounting pressure from board members urging swift containment and minimal admission. The decision before her expanded beyond property. It required confronting the possibility that generational pride had rewritten facts. She recalled childhood evenings when her mother warned her about the Reed side of the family, cautioning that ambition without discipline led to loss. Those warnings had shaped her independence. Yet they now felt incomplete, as though half of a conversation had been omitted intentionally. The skyline outside her window remained unchanged, concrete and steel stretching into the horizon. Beneath that stability lay a family history she had never excavated. She understood that acknowledging the truth could ripple through shareholders, investors, and carefully constructed reputation. Ignoring it, however, would mean repeating the silence that fractured her family decades earlier. Later that afternoon, while reviewing archived financial storage, an assistant discovered a sealed letter in a safe deposit box belonging to her late mother. The envelope was marked with a single handwritten word for Althea. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have. Althea Vaughn opened it in the same office where billion-dollar negotiations had been finalized without hesitation, yet her hands moved with unfamiliar restraint. The handwriting inside belonged to her mother, elegant but uneven in places, as though written during a moment of internal conflict. The letter did not waste words. It confessed. Her mother admitted that the inheritance dispute had never been theft. It had been miscommunication sharpened by pride. The brownstone at the center of the fracture was meant to remain jointly owned between siblings, a shared asset symbolizing their father's perseverance. But legal language was misunderstood, tempers escalated, and silence replaced dialogue. Rather than expose young Althea to courtroom tension and public embarrassment, her mother reshaped the story. She simplified it into betrayal. It was easier to teach distrust than to explain ego. Althea reread the paragraph describing her uncle, not as a thief, but as stubborn, wounded, unwilling to concede misunderstanding. The letter acknowledged fault on both sides. It expressed regret that reconciliation never occurred before illness and distance made it impossible. Her mother wrote that protection sometimes requires distortion, and distortion sometimes becomes legacy. The realization unsettled Althea more than any corporate risk. She had constructed her worldview on the belief that vigilance prevented exploitation. That belief fueled her ascent from poverty to power. Yet the foundation of that belief now appeared incomplete. If the brownstone had always been intended as shared property, then the acquisition that brought it under Vaughn Enterprises carried the echo of an unresolved family fracture. Across the city, Micah Reed was uncovering records of his own. Tax statements revealed that payment delays on the property years earlier coincided with escalating medical bills during Laverne Reed's final months. The lapse had not been negligence, it had been necessity. Resources were diverted to preserve life, not property. The holding company's swift absorption of the deed occurred during that vulnerable window. What appeared externally as abandonment was internally survival. Neither side yet knew the full extent of the other's discoveries, but both now held fragments of a more complicated truth. The conflict was no longer a matter of accusation, it was a collision between inherited narrative and documented reality. Althea confronted a calculation no spreadsheet could simplify. Public acknowledgement of familial connection could invite shareholder concern, trigger scrutiny of past acquisitions, and embolden critics. Silence would preserve stability but perpetuate injustice rooted in misunderstanding. Her empire had been built on strategic caution. This moment demanded moral courage instead. The skyline outside her window felt distant as she folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Redemption. She understood might cost billions. Denial could cost something immeasurable. Before hesitation could reclaim control, Althea instructed her assistant to arrange a private visit to the boy's neighborhood, without cameras, without press, without board approval. Althea Vaughn arrived without announcement, without press vehicles trailing her black sedan, without the polished choreography that usually accompanied her public appearances. The neighborhood greeted her with cracked sidewalks, aging storefronts, and the quiet resilience of residents accustomed to being overlooked. The air carried the faint scent of fried food and motor oil, details that stirred memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. For a moment, the distance between billionaire and child narrowed into something almost unrecognizable. She walked the blocks slowly, absorbing the uneven pavement and peeling paint as if they were fragments of her own past. The duplex where Micah and Caleb lived stood modest but orderly, its small porch swept clean. When the door opened, there was no hostility waiting, only guarded uncertainty. The tension that had defined their first encounter softened into something more complicated, recognition without resolution. Inside, Althea requested to see the original documents Laverne Reed had preserved. Micah retrieved a metal filing box worn at the edges but organized with careful precision. She examined the deed herself, not as a CEO reviewing assets, but as a woman confronting lineage. The paper bore signatures faded with time, yet unmistakable. Reed Vaughn was printed clearly at the top, structured as a joint inheritance agreement. There was no language suggesting sole ownership. There was no evidence of theft. There was only evidence of partnership disrupted by pride. The realization shifted her posture. The boys were no longer challengers threatening her authority. They were living extensions of a family branch she had been taught to distrust. She noticed the crescent birthmark on Caleb's forearm when he reached to steady the document. It no longer startled her. It felt familiar, almost grounding. Althea spoke carefully about restructuring the property's ownership through a trust honoring both family lines. She did not frame it as generosity. She framed it as correction. The brownstone could become a preserved landmark under joint stewardship, its redevelopment adjusted to reflect shared history rather than corporate absorption. The proposal was practical yet symbolic, rooted in restoration rather than compensation. Later that evening, corporate board members responded with urgency after learning of her visit through internal security logs. They warned that reversing the acquisition might signal vulnerability, destabilize investor confidence, and invite scrutiny into other redevelopment holdings. Billions in projected revenue were tied to consistency. Altering one high-profile property could ripple outward unpredictably. Althea understood the mathematics of risk better than anyone advising her. She also understood that leadership measured solely in profit left little room for integrity. The skyline she had built stood as proof of ambition realized, but ambition alone could not repair inherited fracture. As night settled over the city, she finalized arrangements for a public statement. The press conference was scheduled for the following morning, and for the first time in years, the uncertainty ahead felt larger than the buildings bearing her name. The press conference began without spectacle. There were no celebratory banners, no rehearsed applause lines, no triumphant corporate visuals framing the stage. Althea Vaughn stood behind the podium with the composure that had defined her rise, yet her expression carried a gravity unfamiliar to financial analysts who had studied her career. This was not an announcement of expansion. It was an acknowledgement of correction. She confirmed publicly that genealogical verification had established a direct familial connection between herself and Micah and Caleb Reed. The brownstone at the center of controversy, she explained, had originally been structured under a joint family trust that reflected shared inheritance between two siblings decades earlier. She stated clearly that the acquisition process, while legally processed through corporate channels, had overlooked the unresolved historical context embedded within that trust. Her tone did not seek sympathy. It did not offer self-congratulation. It framed the oversight as accountability requiring remedy. Althea announced the formal restoration of ownership shares to Micah and Caleb through a restructured family trust that would preserve both Reed and Vaughn lineage under a unified stewardship model. The redevelopment plan would be adjusted to maintain the property's historic integrity rather than absorb it entirely into a commercial project. She emphasized that restoration was not an act of charity but a correction of incomplete historical understanding. Wealth had separated branches of the same family. Transparency, she suggested, could repair what silence once fractured. Micah and Caleb stood beside her, not positioned behind or beneath, but aligned at equal distance from the podium. Their presence altered the atmosphere. They were no longer framed as challengers or beneficiaries, they were recognized as rightful heirs connected by blood and documentation. The crescent birthmark, now publicly acknowledged as a generational trait, became a subtle symbol of lineage rather than controversy. Media tone shifted in real time. Headlines that once hinted at scandal reframed the narrative as historic reconciliation between corporate power and community roots. Commentators noted the rarity of a billionaire choosing transparency over defensive litigation. Yet skepticism lingered in certain corners. Critics questioned whether the move was strategic damage control disguised as morality. Analysts speculated about potential ripple effects across Vaughn Enterprises' portfolio. Althea did not respond to speculation. Her statement concluded with measured clarity. Leadership required responsibility not only for success but for inherited misunderstanding. In that moment, dominance yielded to truth. The skyline behind her remained unchanged, yet the meaning attached to it had shifted. As reporters prepared to disperse, Caleb stepped forward with documentation he had uncovered during deeper archival research. His findings suggested the brownstone carried historical designation potential tied to early post-war black home ownership in the city. The implication expanded the property's significance beyond family dispute, hinting at a legacy far older and far more profound than anyone had yet considered. Caleb's archival discovery shifted the story beyond family reconciliation and into historical significance. The brownstone was not merely inherited property, it was one of the first homes purchased by their great-grandfather, Elijah Reed, in the late 1940s after navigating discriminatory housing barriers that limited where black families could legally settle. County records showed that Elijah secured the property through relentless negotiation at a time when ownership itself was resistance. The deed symbolized more than shelter. It represented permanence in a city that had once tried to keep families like his temporary. As historians reviewed the documents Caleb uncovered, a deeper narrative surfaced. The crescent-shaped birthmark that linked the Vaughn and Reed branches had become, over generations, an informal emblem within the family. It was never recorded in official registries, yet stories about it appeared in personal letters and journal entries. Elders described it as a reminder that survival required unity. Somewhere along the decades, pride fractured that unity, but the mark endured. What was once dismissed publicly as coincidence now stood as visible proof of shared lineage and shared resilience. Althea moved decisively after reviewing the expanded historical findings. She allocated funding not only to restore ownership shares, but to preserve the property formally as a protected landmark under the name the Reed-Vaughn House. The redevelopment blueprint shifted from commercial ambition to cultural preservation. Architectural teams were instructed to maintain the original brick facade and structural character. Plaques would document Elijah Reed's acquisition and the family's interwoven history, ensuring that future generations understood the significance of the address beyond real estate value. Micah entered a structured mentorship program within Vaughn Enterprises, not as compensation but as investment in leadership continuity. His strategic instincts and measured temperament impressed senior executives who once questioned his credibility. Caleb began compiling family documents into a written historical archive, determined that no misunderstanding would again distort their lineage. The brothers transitioned from overlooked claimants to custodians of narrative. The resolution carried weight but not fantasy. Years of separation could not be undone. Financial disparity had shaped experiences differently across family branches, yet acknowledgement bridged what silence once widened. Power, tempered by truth, felt steadier. Poverty, answered with dignity, felt less isolating. The crescent mark, once a quiet genetic trait, had become confirmation of belonging. In the final public unveiling, 3 figures stood before restored brick glowing under late afternoon light. Sleeves concealed the matching birthmarks, yet their presence was understood without display. The skyline rose behind them, unchanged yet recontextualized by the story beneath it. Sometimes proof is written on the skin long before it appears in court, and as cameras faded and headlines settled, one question lingered beyond celebration. How many other stories remained buried beneath concrete, waiting for someone brave enough to look? Stories like this remind us that truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently for someone brave enough to uncover it. If this journey moved you, stay connected for more stories that challenge power, protect legacy, and reveal what's hidden beneath the surface. Share this with someone who believes family history matters. And if you value stories that don't just entertain but mean something, make sure you don't miss the next one. If you discovered that part of your success was built on a misunderstanding from generations ago, would you protect your reputation or correct the truth, no matter the cost? Tell me what you would do.